Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the changes during the 18th century, all right? We are talking about major changes that are going to come down the pipe, like right after the Enlightenment, or on the heels of the Enlightenment anyway, or kind of like during the late Enlightenment, and discuss how the daily lives of Europeans is majorly changing, but also slightly staying the same. Like in a couple of little different weird ways, because you always got to remember that continuity and change over time thing that the AP class curriculum loves for you to analyze, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is we left off in class discussing the family, right? When we started talking about before 1750, how most people were still very agrarian and most people were getting married around the age of 25 to 26 for an economic arrangement, right? Then what's going to happen is your family's going to come together to actually make a consistent little bit amount of money off this off this coupling of two people. And we also discussed how there was the adoption of the nuclear family, right? That was happening in the 1750s. We also discussed how that nuclear family is going to continue, see, that's a continuity right there, to continue to grow during the 1750s. However, there would be a change in the motivation for marriage. It would be focused more around love and stuff like that, and more emotion, less around economic, an economic relationship between the two parties. Another big thing that's going to happen, though, as well, is when we were living in agrarian communities, we had those community controls. We talked about harikari, and we talked about the parades for, like, mean husbands. We also discussed, like, shotgun weddings is what you might refer to them as now. But then we also talked about how as that whole agrarian village life begins to dissolve and we have urbanization moving people into the cities during the 18th century, we are going to see what's known as the illegitimacy explosion, where there's going to be a large growth of illegitimate births in urban areas, right? For example, 2% to 10% in German-speaking areas of German-speaking urban areas, they're going to see a illegitimacy rate of 2%, 5 times itself, quintuple itself to 10%, which is really, really aggressive and a very large growth. Now, this didn't really happen in agrarian or rural communities as much. It was much more of a city issue, right? Now, the next major change that we're actually going to see, though, as well, is now that there are all of these kids, like, running around and stuff like that, a view of children is going to change, though, also. Now, the illegitimacy explosion and the changing view of children are not necessarily related. They are sometimes, but not all the time, right? But what you're going to see happen is that dramatically, the Enlightenment is going to lead to a change in how we view the child, right? How they viewed the relationship between parents and children, how they viewed the children's position within the family and within the work-life balance, okay? Because it's going to really, really take off from the Enlightenment, right? Not by technology, not by society, but the Enlightenment will actually push these major changes, right? For example, you can see some of these earliest thought patterns begin to change in a book that's actually by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote this very famous book known as Emile, which is all about how to educate your children, right? How children need to kind of educate themselves and have like a garden, and they need to be out like away from a society and outside of a city area in a more rural area, discovering plant life and communing with the woods and nature. Sounds a lot like transcendentalism invoking Mr. Roddy right now. So the thing that you need to understand, though, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau is also going to begin to discuss that the relationship between parents and children must change, right? And that the parents are meant to be stewards of the child's education, above their love, and also making sure that they are taken care of, right? Now, because you have to understand that before the Enlightenment, children were viewed very drastically differently than they were after the Enlightenment, right? Before the Enlightenment, there was literally a problem known as infanticide, right? And infanticide was when actually women, during the illegitimacy explosion or during the period of time where community controls were super aggressive and literally it was very, very frowned upon to have a birth outside of a marriage, many women were actually going into places like the forest and stuff like that and killing their newborn children or abandoning them, right? And that is a thing called infanticide. Now, what's going to end up occurring, though, is that for a long time, governments did nothing about this. But after the Enlightenment, the government adopts this strategy known as foundling hospitals, right? And foundling hospitals was a place that you could bring a child and surrender it, right? And you could actually surrender it, and usually foundling hospitals were going to be run by like nuns and some monks and stuff like that, by some church branches and sects, and also some city governments will actually establish foundling hospitals as well as safe places to actually give over children that could possibly be like literally killed by their parents because of the economic hardships that the parents are going through, right? Now, the other thing that's really, really interesting about this, though, is also just in the back of your mind, kind of remember, this didn't really like kind of help help child mortality. Foundling hospitals typically resulted in a large-scale neglect of some children because they had so many of them at one time. Like literally, Jean-Jacques Rousseau gave all 5 of his daughters, all 5 of the daughters that he actually fathered, to foundling hospitals when he was actually alive. That is crazy, right? Now, also in conjunction with the child and the view of children as well, there was this thing called wet nursing during the Enlightenment or before the Enlightenment, okay? Wet nursing was a process where literally what ended up happening is women would actually take their children out to rural areas and have a poorer woman or a peasant woman actually nurse their child, right? Like they wouldn't do it themselves. Like before the Enlightenment, women didn't commonly breastfeed their own children. What would actually happen is they would give it to another woman to breastfeed their child, right? Which is wild, all right? So like now, and like there was a very, very common trend. It was dangerous for the child because there was transportation involved, and it was also dangerous just because literally this woman who is now wet nursing is also being forced into an economic hardship where literally if she has a child like while she's wet nursing and can't actually like feed the rich woman's child, she may choose to abandon that other one, right? So this is a very, very aggressive thing, and it's a terrible idea, but Enlightenment thinkers are going to rail against this entire thing, being like, no, nurse your own kids. It's not weird, right? You'd be like, wealthy women, middle class and upper class women, it is not strange to nurse your own child. That is your child. You should be actually taking care of that. And so that's going to lead to a dramatic uptick in actually women and mothers in middle and upper class homes becoming more involved with the child rearing process and dedicating space to that, right? Creating rooms for children, right? Creating nurseries, right? And actually finding ways to facilitate the bond between mother and child in a more dramatic way, right? You also have to understand another great way to look at this, the changing view of children, is their clothing, right? Like, so like, for example, before the Enlightenment, children in upper and middle class homes were often dressed in like little adult clothes, right? Girls would sometimes begin wearing corsets, whalebone corsets, as early as the age of 5, which literally was used to train their waist and make it smaller. And I felt exactly like that cat right there when I just said that to you, like, what the heck is going on? Why would you put a baby in a whalebone corset, right? But after the Enlightenment, again, the changing view of children will show us, hey, let that baby run around naked if it feels like it, all right? Put it in nice billowy clothes, right? Big fluffy clothes so he can run around and move around and stuff like that and be free, and his body can be allowed to grow, right? Again, facilitating a more nurturing relationship between mother, children, and the growing nuclear family dynamic, making it more along the lines of like, my mom and dad care about me and I care about them. Less of being like, I must go into the fields and harvest or else the father is going to be upset, right? So this is leading to a more dynamic shift in how we view children, right? And their clothing, it can even be seen in that way, right? Also, the other thing about it as well is before the Enlightenment, children were sometimes seen as a burden or as labor, right? As in basically being like, hey, you are either a burden if you're an upper class or middle class family, or potentially you might also see this growth as well. Literally, like poorer families would have kids to help with the workforce and the actual chores around the home. Now it's also before the Enlightenment, there was this old phrase that people used to say, spare the rod, spoil the child, as in like if you don't like hit your kids a lot and stuff like that and keep them in line, you are spoiling them. Now what's going to end up happening though after the Enlightenment, they're going to begin to dedicate space to kids, right? They're going to begin to dedicate relationship value to kids. And they're going to start realizing that there has to be a very, very deep connection between parent and child, right? And this is going to help lead to a rise in elementary education because people are like, I want my kid to be able to read. So really quick, and then what's going to end up happening is a lot of communities all over are going to begin to actually like create elementary schools for children and also increase the educational value. And also it's going to begin to become more available to more classes, right? Going into the middle class and then eventually after like several more decades, having opportunities for lower class children to be able to be educated as well. Now, going into it though, also, like you got to understand that dramatic view of children, and that right there, that's little Mr. Terry, right? Little Mr. Terry, if he was born before the Enlightenment, would not be seen as something yay and cute and adorable. I was a big dinosaur fan, by the way, and I'm playing with a spool of thread, if any of y'all are curious about that. And the other thing about it though as well, is that after the Enlightenment, that little guy right there will be seen as somebody that deserves space and deserves nurturement, right? Now, another big change that's going to happen though as well is access to goods, right? Because by this point, the Columbian Exchange has fully set in. We are seeing the agricultural revolution produce a lot more goods and items, and now we are also seeing the putting out system in the cottage industry and cities begin to turn out more goods because of early factories and cities, and the putting out system in the cottage industry in the rural areas are producing a wealth of products that people have never seen before, right? So we're also, though, during this process as well, seeing a new class emerge that is going to have access to these goods, right? right? And what we used to call this class is just the middle class, the small growing gentry or middle class, right? But now they're adopting a new name, right? They're adopting a new persona, and there's now also going to be divisions within that one class as well. You might be upper middle class or lower middle class. Now, the upper middle class, or the upper echelons of middle class, the ones that are now growing so wealthy that they can buy all kinds of stuff. They can buy new houses. They can put stuff in their house. They can literally actually have a relationship with their kids. That group of people are now being referred to as the bourgeois. Now the bourgeois, all right, or the bourgeoisie, if you want to refer to them as such, right? Now the bourgeois, those people, just so you understand who they are, right? The bourgeois are your early business owners, right? They're the ones making money off of the earliest factories. They are the ones that are actually rising from the lower classes or the lower middle class and founding businesses, or they might be bankers or loan officers or things like that are actually going to help them rise themselves up through the classes and make some more money, right? Now this is also not just limited to France. Now, the reason why I have that put up there, right, is because 9 times out of 10, if you bring this word up, the bourgeois, most people will equate it to the French Revolution itself, and we also will talk about the bourgeois and the bourgeoisie. You can call it either one. It's really up to you. All right, so now, they're not going to be limited just to France, because when you say that word, most people think French Revolution, because we will talk about them a lot during the French Revolution. But actually, you're going to see the earliest adoption of the concept of the bourgeoisie actually happen in the Netherlands, right, with the growing East India Company and those merchants making a lot of money and actually participating more actively in the economy, because goods are now more available for them than they ever have been, both foreign goods and domestic goods, right? You've got goods in your country that are now beginning to be churned out, whether they be agricultural or produced in a cottage, right? Whether they be textiles or potatoes. You've got a lot more stuff that you can actually access, all right? Now, the other thing about it, though, is there are a lot of foreign goods that you can now access as well. You have timber coming in from the Americas. You have large amounts of cotton beginning to be grown in India, right? That are now flooding in through the ports, and you now have enough money to buy stuff that's made from them, and this is leading to what's known as the consumer revolution, right? Driven heavily by that new bourgeois class, right? They are going to start buying things like it's going out of style. Now, something that you have to understand, though, as well, is that the consumer revolution was accessible to the lower classes as well. Lower classes were able to buy some of these goods, just not the same kind of goods that the bourgeois classes were able to purchase, right? This new class, though, is going to begin to imitate the wealthy, and they're going to begin to define themselves by the things that they buy, right? So this is all related to that consumer revolution. So in the 1700s, you are going to see a skyrocketing of not prices on things, but accessibility to things. And you're beginning to see the mercantilistic ideas of the world slowly start fading away, and the rise of free markets as defined by Adam Smith really showing up. Because people are now purchasing things for privacy. They're purchasing new home goods. They're purchasing new clothes. And they're even adding rooms to their homes, right? Again, you can see this very, very heavily when you look at the Netherlands. That right there is Amsterdam, right? And those homes right there were all purchased and actually owned by bourgeois, middle class, upper middle class, merchant class, gentry-style families in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, right? Looking at them as well, notice that they have several extra rooms. Their floors have been added over time. Also, really, really cool thing, all the houses in Amsterdam have these hooks on the front of them, as you can see right there. And it's actually because they literally wanted to be able to raise goods up out of the canal and stuff like that off boats and then put them in their attics so they could store them away because they had just bought them, right? Or they might actually have just imported these goods from a boat that has just gotten back from the Indian Ocean or something like that. And the interesting thing about it is all the houses in the Netherlands were also built on a little tilt, they were just tilted forward so stuff didn't bang into the front of them, which is really, really cool. So now look, the other thing about it though as well is new rooms might be added to these homes or spaces dedicated to them. For example, this is a drawing room that many women would actually hang out in and stuff like that. And it was basically an entertaining room where literally you would just chill with your friends and have tea or sit on this chaise lounge or whatever, right? Or try on outfits with this new privacy shield, right? Hence the privacy thing. And poorer communities, maybe lower middle class families, would maybe even buy privacy shields to help separate one big room into a couple of little smaller ones, right? And so you actually can see that right here. And this goes towards that whole idea of dedicating space to kids, right? Okay, and actually creating more space within the home. Also, lower class families also are going to begin to invest in things like dishware, right? Because if you were from a lower class family, literally the entire family typically before the consumer revolution would eat out of one communal bowl, right? One bowl, everybody got a spoon, right? But now the biggest Christmas present you might get is your own bowl, right? Or a spoon or other dishware and stuff like that. Also, underpants became a really, really big thing during this time period, and especially then it catapults itself after the Industrial Revolution. Poorer communities and middle-class families are also going to begin to purchase things like stoves to make it so they can actually cook things more efficiently. Instead of cooking over an open fire, they'll be able to cook inside of cast iron stoves, right? Also, you're going to see fashion and clothing begin to skyrocket, and this right here is the clothing of a noble or an upper class. But notice what a middle-class member might wear, right? Maybe a cheaper version of it, right? A toned-down version of it, right? A accessible version of it. There's literally this one writing from a woman in Paris who says that I once saw my milkman walking through the streets of Paris and he looked as though he was wealthy, right? Because literally now there's more access to different goods and there's more access to other things. And this right here is as well is there's going to even be periodicals that begin to run around and like fashion advice and stuff like that. And this right here is Rose Breton, who is actually the fashion advisor to Marie Antoinette. You're also going to see new books pop up. And speaking of books, that was something you could buy as well during this consumer revolution. And also you're going to see even more leisure, right? I know Rosie loves to talk about leisure, right? Rosie loves to be like, leisure time! Yes, exactly, right? Even more of that stuff, Rosie. Even more leisure time. And a lot of it's going to be centered around reading, okay? Because literacy is blowing up. If you have more access to elementary education, what you're beginning to see also is that rise in elementary education and also children's literacy rates, even though they were pretty strict and intense. Like, you got mollywopped on the knuckles if you actually, like, messed up your reading and stuff like that when you were in school during this time period. But at least now some kids had the ability to read, right? And so if they have the ability to read, and mom and dad do as well, that means the access to books that aren't just about religion is going to need to grow, because people are now demanding other things to read that aren't just the Bible or aren't just like dialogues on religion. So you're going to see chat books rise up, which are like cheap, small little books that you can read in maybe a day's worth, right? I like to equate this to like books that you might have gotten at the Scholastic Book Fair that were tiny and could have been read in like an afternoon, right? Novels are going to begin to pop up as well. For example, this one's by Goethe. It is Faust. It's about a man. It's like a novel that is about a man selling his soul to the devil, right? This one is Robinson Crusoe, right? Which is actually about a man stranded on an island, and his guide is showing him the native customs. And this means and demonstrates to us that Europeans are beginning to have a growing knowledge of the world out there and the world around them. Pamphlets are now accessible, the encyclopedia, and even newspapers, right? Which is crazy. That right there is actually a newspaper that's going to pop up, because the very first newspaper that actually popped up was in Austria. It's called the Wiener Zeitung, which literally means the Vienna newspaper in German, and it's going to be the very first one that shows up in like the 1760s, all right? So like the newspaper becomes a big thing. That right there, the ad right here, is a football match. We'll get to that here in a second. But also the other thing we need to understand, though, are these lingering absolutists going to attempt to censor a lot of this stuff? They are, right? Like, they are going to attempt to censor a lot of these books, right? They're going to attempt to censor pamphlets that might be running around talking negatively about them. But the question was their censorship effective? And the answer is a big fat inflammatory no. All right, so yeah, they were actually almost unable to censor what was going on, because these markets and things like that now are so large that it's almost impossible to stop people from reading pamphlets, even if it says something negative about you, all the Louis from France. Now, like, so next up, you have to understand we have some new leisure activities that are popping up. We're expanding beyond carnival, beyond village festivals, beyond all this stuff, and we're seeing the growth of taverns in the countryside, right? Pubs and hangout areas for when men are done work, they will go and relax there. You're seeing those coffee houses continue to expand in urban areas where enlightenment ideas are like literally flowing through smoke-filled and cigar-filled rooms. You're seeing the theater, right? Theaters are now also becoming more accessible to common people, and many of them are beginning to pop up in different versions of theaters, maybe a lower like scale theater for common people to actually go to, a middle class theater, an upper class theater, right? And now everybody has access to theatrical productions, right? Public fairs become really, really big as well. And then also spectator sports. Now, with one of them we've already talked a little bit about. We talked a little bit about blood sports before, right? But that is still a continuity. Blood sports are still a very popular thing in Europe, right? And a lot of people still go to boxing, cockfights, bear baiting, right? Which is literally where they would tie a bear to a post and they would release dogs on him to see how many dogs like the bear killed, and or vice versa. There was also another thing called rat baiting as well, where literally like dogs would be released in pits full of rats, and they would see how many like rats the dog could kill in like a minute. You know what I mean? Like, so, but also bull baiting was big, of course, the origin of the English bulldog. So yeah, like now look, the other thing though is also horse racing. Another spectator sports are going to begin to grow, and evidence of the earliest roots of football. So yeah, like, so, or actually soccer start growing in the 1700s as well. Now, last but not least, we are going to see a major change in art, right? So now, like, so what we need to understand though, art is very important, okay? But remember, if you ever get asked a question about writing something about art, when you're actually asked something in the AP test, If you don't know specific examples of those artworks, avoid that question like the plague, right? But really quickly, just so we know, okay, you're going to see the growth in Baroque art first and early on. We know that already, which was grand, intense, praises the church and the absolutists. This right here, for example, is a Baroque sculpture of Louis XIV by some artist that starts with a G that I can't remember for the sake of my life right now. And then also you've got seriously intense Baroque architecture being seen in St. Peter's Cathedral right here as well. Very intense, very large, very over the top. This is Caravaggio, right? The Temptation of St. Matthew right there. That is Baroque as well. It is very grand, and Rembrandt is going to begin to actually demonstrate the Dutch version of Baroque art as well, with the Night's Watch and other works like that. Now, the next up one we know is Rococo, right? And that's your warm pastels. The Swing by Fragonard is a very, very famous Rococo piece, right? That demonstrates our pastels, our chubby little cherubs, our warmness, our sentimental value. Still very much an upper class movement. But then our next one up is known as neoclassical art, right? And neoclassical art is going to really, really hit home and take place during the 1700s, right? Neoclassical art is going to begin to simplify itself, right? And it's going to have a more simple symmetry. It's going to be a main figure in the foreground, and it's not going to be so overwhelming and grandiose, right? Neoclassical art is much more about invoking that Greco-Roman style, right? Going back to Greco-Roman style architecture, for example, that right there is the Pantheon. This guy right here also is probably the most famous like neoclassical artist ever. That is Jacques-Louis David, and that right there is one of his Bonaparte paintings, and this is another one of his pieces as well. It's one of my favorites. It's called The Death of Marat, right? And you'll understand that piece a little bit better when we get there, when we talk about that stuff, when we get to the French Revolution. But I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.